What happens when a Senate hearing stops sounding like oversight and starts sounding like a verdict on how power punishes people before their work is even judged? In this striking exchange, Senator John Kennedy defends Education Secretary Linda McMahon against what he calls a wave of political attacks, ridicule, and media contempt. But beneath the sharp words is a deeper fight over something much bigger than one public official. Because once the accusations are laid out, the question changes. Was McMahon targeted because she failed, or because she was trying to change a system too many people had already decided could never be touched? And in that moment, this hearing turns from routine politics into a story about reform, resistance, and who gets to control the narrative of public education.
Senator Kennedy.
Madam Secretary, first I want to make it clear that my remarks do not refer to my good friend Senator Shaheen. I want to start by saying one person's opinion. You are so cool, literally and figuratively. They call you names and you just ignore them. I also want to say from the record, I don't think we ought to mislead the American people. This isn't your budget. This budget was put together by OMB in the White House. Every White House does it, sends us a budget. We take a look at it. Some of it we adopt, most of it we ignore. So all this play acting for the cameras is just that, play acting. I want to take you down memory lane. I'm going to come back to the extraordinary job you've done at the Department of Education, which was, when you took it over, was the poster child for excess federal government, chock full of a bunch of woke race baiters whose job was to get in the way of our teachers and our teachers' age. But I want to take you down memory lane because you've done this despite all of the obstacles. Do you remember when my colleague Senator Schumer said the following? I'm going to quote: "Americans don't want a radical, out-of-touch billionaire slashing funding for public schools. Linda McMahon is not qualified to lead America's public education, but that's why Trump nominated her. She's the perfect choice to burn our public education system to the ground," end quote. Remember that?
I do.
You remember when Congressman Mark Pocan, I could be mispronouncing his name, so I apologize, said, quote, "Linda McMahon should stick to wrestling." You remember that?
I actually don't remember that one.
Boy, you can only be young
Did
once.
pretty well with that, though.
You can only be young once, but boy, you can always be immature, can't you? Do you remember when The Nation magazine, very, very democratic magazine, published an article entitled "Linda McMahon's Only Qualification as Education Secretary is a History of Spreading Hate"? And this is what they said. Quote, "She is 76 years old and wants her legacy to be turning the bigotry that made her so obscenely rich into public policy. She's a simpleton." My God. I want extra time, Madam Chair. Everybody else has gotten it. I have been so impressed with the work that you have done in lifting up elementary and secondary education and trying to whittle down that giant rogue beast that we call the Department of Education, the work you've done on school choice and returning authority back to the states and local government and fighting anti-Semitism and fighting for women's sports. In a couple of minutes, tell me about your accomplishments. I know you can't do it in 2 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm glad I really don't remember a lot of those quotes.
Oh, there's more.
But
They hit you with everything but a chair. It's disgusting.
Well, I can tell you what I believe we've accomplished a lot. As I mentioned prior to visiting so many states and to see what kinds of education systems many of those states have, from classical education, from that I saw in Florida and other states, to states that have really accepted returning their reading programs to evidence-based phonics, and we've seen the response to that from many states who are looking now to take those same programs into numeracy to make sure that the math scores are coming up. When you walk into a department and you look across the country and the President of the United States has told you that he was embarrassed and ashamed by the state of education in our country, and not only across the country but in its place in the world, and he expects you to do something to make a difference in that, because what we've been doing is not working. The innovations that we have seen to bring the level of schools' reading and math programs up is be innovations in the states. They don't come from the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. So what I hope to do is to put together a toolkit to leave behind and to share with these states, this is what is working. These are some of the things that we have seen. The Mississippi Miracle. Mississippi was next to last, in reading. You know that very well, Senator. And they, through their own invention, it took about 10 years, but they didn't give up, and they kept doing it. And the steps that they took and made, Louisiana adopted, Florida adopted, Tennessee, other states. And so we have seen through the states' innovation and continued funding, which will continue to come through government programs, they have made a difference. And that's why states are the center of what's going to be successful for them, whether it is looking at their children, with disabilities. That is why in our budget proposal, we have asked for the largest increase, $500 million to go into IDEA funding, because there are more students who need these. So I think that we've made some incredibly significant accomplishments, and we've just begun. I've only been here just a little bit over a year, but we're on the road to continue to look at the states and what we need to help them with their funding to take on more of these programs. And those programs that are federal will stay in the federal government. Title A stays in the federal government. IDEA stays in the federal government to make that funding, but to send it, directly to the states. So I'm pleased with where we've come so far, but we clearly have a lot of work yet to do. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for your service.
By the end of this exchange, the real story is no longer just that John Kennedy got blunt, or that Linda McMahon was praised by an ally in a Senate hearing. The deeper story is about how quickly politics can turn public service into public theater, and how difficult it becomes to separate performance from substance once that process begins. Kennedy opens by making something clear. In his view, much of what the public has been shown about McMahon is not honest evaluation, but political staging. He says the attacks were excessive, mocking, and unfair. He quotes critics who dismissed her background, her qualifications, even her character, and he frames those comments not as scrutiny, but as ritual humiliation. That setup matters because it gives the clip its first layer of tension. Viewers are not only being asked whether McMahon has done a good job, they are being asked whether she was judged long before the job itself was truly allowed to speak. And that is where the hearing becomes bigger than one nominee or one cabinet official. It becomes a portrait of how power, media, and ideology often collide before policy is even fully debated. Kennedy's method is familiar, but effective. He does not begin with technical metrics. He begins with memory. He takes the audience back through the quotes, the headlines, the mocking language, the way critics framed McMahon as unfit before the public could see what she would actually do. In documentary terms, that is a powerful move because it establishes the emotional battlefield before the policy battlefield. It tells the audience, before we talk about outcomes, understand the atmosphere this person walked into, understand the assumptions, understand the contempt. And once that frame is in place, the rest of the clip becomes a kind of rebuttal, not just to a set of criticisms, but to the entire idea that McMahon's role was doomed or unserious from the start. Then the focus shifts, and this is where the story deepens. McMahon begins to describe what she says her department has actually tried to do. She talks about visiting states and seeing education systems up close. She emphasizes classical education models, evidence-based phonics, efforts to improve reading and numeracy, and the belief that innovation comes from the states rather than from bureaucracy in Washington. This is where the clip quietly transforms from a political defense into a philosophical clash over governance itself. Because beneath all the insults and applause lies a basic question. Where should educational power live? In federal bureaucracy or closer to the states and local systems that actually run schools every day? McMahon's answer is clear. She argues that the strongest ideas are emerging from the states, from places willing to test reforms, stay patient, and build results over time. Her reference to Mississippi, once near the bottom and then improved through persistent work, becomes more than an anecdote. It becomes a symbol of her whole argument that reform is possible, but not necessarily from the center. That point gives the clip its documentary force. It is not simply about defending a person. It is about defending a model of change. Another reason this exchange holds attention so well is that it contains two competing moral narratives. Kennedy's narrative is that McMahon inherited a department he describes as bloated, ideological, and obstructive. In his words, a symbol of excessive federal government. From that perspective, her job is not to protect the institution as it is, but to cut it down, redirect it, and return authority outward. McMahon's own narrative complements that by saying national embarrassment over educational decline requires innovation, honesty, and willingness to look beyond Washington for answers. But critics, as Kennedy frames them, see the same project very differently. In their telling, McMahon represents danger, a threat to public education, a political appointee brought in not to improve the system, but to dismantle it. That split is why the clip works. Because the viewer is not just watching praise, they are watching a collision between two completely different interpretations of what reform even means. Is reform renewal, or is reform destruction under a friendlier name? Is decentralization empowerment or abandonment? Is reducing federal control a path to innovation or a retreat from national responsibility? The hearing does not resolve those questions, but it makes them visible. And visibility is often what keeps an audience watching. There is also an important stylistic reason this clip can hold retention. Kennedy uses outrage, but he uses it with narrative shape. He begins with praise for McMahon's composure, then pivots into political memory, then escalates with the insults, then turns to validation by asking her to list achievements. That structure matters. It gives the viewer a sense of progression. First the injury, then the defense, then the evidence. And once McMahon starts describing reading reform, state innovation, idea funding, anti-Semitism efforts, women's sports, and the concept of leaving a toolkit behind for states, the clip moves from personality into policy. That movement is exactly what a good documentary-style commentary should preserve, because it keeps the audience from feeling like they are trapped inside pure partisan noise. It gives them a reason to stay beyond the headline. It says, there is more here than the attack. There is a model of governance being argued over in real time. The emotional center of the clip, though, is composure. Kennedy repeatedly praises McMahon for absorbing the attacks without losing control. That emotional detail is important because it frames her not just as a policymaker, but as someone who endured political contempt and kept moving. Whether viewers agree with her agenda or not, that framing gives the exchange human tension. It turns the video into a story about resilience under pressure, about what happens when a public figure is mocked, minimized, and then invited to answer with outcomes instead of outrage. And in media terms, that is a compelling reversal. The person framed by critics as unserious is given the floor to sound structured, calm, and future-focused. The hearing, then, becomes a battle not only over education policy, but over legitimacy itself. Who gets to be taken seriously? Who gets to define success? Who gets to decide whether disruption is courageous or reckless? That is why the clip feels more consequential than its runtime suggests. It is a small window into a larger national argument about schools, bureaucracy, culture, and the authority to decide what children should be taught and who should shape that future. By the time the exchange closes, the audience is left with more than a defense of Linda McMahon. They are left with an image of an education system at war with its own identity, torn between federal direction and state experimentation, between old institutional habits and reformist impatience, between suspicion and reinvention. And that is where your narration should land. Not on a simple victory line, but on the bigger tension the clip reveals. Because in the end, this is not only a story about how one woman was attacked, it is a story about what happens when education becomes one more battlefield in a nation already fighting over expertise, control, culture, and the meaning of reform itself. And once that fight begins, every hearing stops being just about policy. It becomes a struggle to define the future before the public ever gets to live inside it.